Christmas always came with a certain weight in our family, but nothing prepared me for the humiliation that unfolded this year. My son-in-law, Jackson, had always enjoyed teasing me, but tonight he decided to make me the center of attention in the worst possible way. Listen here, old-timer. Everyone knows the Battle of Vicksburg happened in 1864. Jackson's voice was too loud, slicing through the comfortable chatter in my den. I set my mug of peppermint cocoa down on the side table, my fingers pausing for a second. The room grew quiet, the only sound the faint crackle from the fireplace. I straightened in my favorite worn recliner, years of classroom composure keeping my voice calm. Actually, Jackson, it was May to July, 1863. My words were slow, measured, but inside I felt that old ache. 40 years of teaching history and still, no one in this house listened. Jackson's face flushed above his crisp holiday sweater. He slammed his palm down on the mantel, shaking the snow globe and sending a picture of my late wife askew. Enough, Dad, he snapped, using the title like an insult. Nobody cares about your ancient trivia. Across the room, my daughter Megan flinched, her hands twisting in her lap. Jackson, please, she said softly, but her husband ignored her. I tried to hold on to my patience, remembering my own father's lessons about dignity in the face of disrespect. Jackson scoffed and turned to the guests scattered around the den, neighbors, friends, a few coworkers from his law firm. You see what I deal with? The guy can't even get basic facts right. He's losing it. Megan stood up abruptly, her voice trembling. That's enough, Jackson. Dad knows what he's talking about. I looked at my daughter, grateful for her defense, but Jackson just rolled his eyes. You're taking his side now? Great. He yanked his coat from the rack with theatrical annoyance. Let's go, Megan. I'm done listening to this old man's rambling. He marched toward the door, not bothering to look back. Megan paused at the threshold, her eyes meeting mine, blue like her mother's, full of worry and apology. I'm sorry, Dad, she whispered. It's all right, sweetheart. Drive safe. The lie came easily, after years of practice. Jackson slammed the door, and I stood there in the sudden hush, the word, fool, echoing in my mind. Through the window, I watched their SUV back out onto Cedar Lane, red taillights vanishing into the snowy night. I took a long breath, the kind that feels like starting over. My house, usually filled with warmth and laughter at Christmas, suddenly seemed empty, the silence pressing down on me. After a moment, I wandered over to the bookshelf. Photographs stared back, Megan's wedding, my old faculty group, my grandkids building a snowman last winter. My degrees hung on the wall beside a yellowed program from my retirement ceremony at Rutgers. I'd spent 4 decades teaching American history to restless college freshmen, always believing facts mattered. Apparently, they didn't anymore. The fireplace hissed as the last log crumbled. I poured myself another cup of cocoa, hands steady despite the tremor in my heart. Fool, I thought. Just a foolish old man, out of place at his own Christmas. Outside, snow drifted past the porch light, coating the world in soft, forgiving white. Other houses glowed with cheer, laughter leaking from their windows. Normal families, I guessed, not arguing over Civil War trivia. I pressed my palm to the cold glass, staring out at Maplewood's quiet streets, searching for something I couldn't name. Christmas was still 5 days away. 5 days to decide whether I'd let tonight define me, or find a way to remind my family who I really was. The next morning, the sting of Jackson's words still lingered. I went about my usual routines, shoveling the walkway, refilling the bird feeder, reading the Newark Gazette at the kitchen table. But every so often, I'd catch my reflection in the window and see a man haunted by his own family's laughter. By midday, Megan called. Her voice carried that forced lightness, the kind you learn to recognize after raising children. Hi, Dad. I wanted to talk about Christmas dinner. We're having a small group, just Jackson's parents, some neighbors, a couple of his colleagues from the firm. She hesitated. Would you come? Her invitation caught me by surprise, but I kept my tone steady. Of course, honey. I'd love to. I tried not to wonder if Jackson was behind this, or if Megan was simply trying to keep peace in a house where peace was always fragile. Should I bring anything? Just yourself, Dad, she replied, relief breaking through in her words. That's enough. After we hung up, I marked December 25th on my kitchen calendar in blue pen. 5 days to prepare, 5 days to decide if I'd play the quiet grandfather in the corner or remind everyone, especially Jackson, who I really was. The week passed in slow motion. I baked gingerbread cookies, sent Christmas cards to old friends in Florida and Oregon, and spent too much time rereading letters from my late wife. Each morning, I'd make a fresh pot of coffee and promise myself that I wouldn't let Jackson's opinion ruin my holidays. But the word, fool, had buried itself somewhere deep, and it echoed at odd moments, even in the quiet of the night. Thursday morning, a dusting of snow covered my old Buick in the driveway. I bundled up in my thickest coat and headed to the grocery store for supplies. As I moved through the aisles, I ran into Mr. Silverman, my neighbor from across the street. Ed, you look thoughtful this morning, he said, nodding to my shopping cart. I shrugged. Just Christmas family drama, I suppose. He smiled knowingly. Happens to all of us, eventually. He peered at me over his glasses. Just remember, nobody can take away who you really are. Not even your family. It was good advice, and I tucked it away for later. When I got home, I sat in my den surrounded by books. History lined every shelf, biographies, maps, faded volumes with handwritten notes tucked between their pages. This library wasn't just a room, it was the story of my life. I traced my finger along the spine of my old Civil War reference and flipped it open to the entry on Vicksburg. May 18th to July 4th, 1863, it read. My own handwriting from decades ago underlined the dates. That evening, as the house filled with the scent of pine and gingerbread, I wrapped Megan's gift, a first edition biography of Abigail Adams. She'd mentioned wanting it months ago, and I'd spent hours hunting one down online. For Jackson, I settled on a bottle of fine Kentucky bourbon, the kind he bragged about to his friends but never bought for himself. I wasn't petty, but I believed in meeting hostility with quiet dignity. Christmas Eve arrived cold and bright. I laid out my best suit, the navy one I'd worn to my retirement dinner at Rutgers. I ironed my shirt, polished my shoes, and made sure my silver tie clip gleamed. Presentation mattered, my father had always said. People respect a man who respects himself. I looked in the mirror before I left, gray hair neatly combed, shoulders squared, a hint of determination in my eyes. I felt older than I'd ever been, but something inside me flickered with resolve. Tonight would not belong to Jackson, not this year. As I loaded the gifts into my Buick and pulled out onto Cedar Lane, I noticed other families bustling up and down the snowy sidewalks, arms full of presents and laughter. For a moment, I wished my own family could be that simple. But life, I'd learned, was never simple, and sometimes standing your ground was the best gift you could give yourself. Megan's house stood out on Willow Drive, decked in white lights and green garland, a red bow on the mailbox. The driveway was already crowded, Jackson's parents' Lexus, a couple of his co-workers' sedans, and the blue minivan that belonged to the Hendersons from next door. I parked at the curb, took a steadying breath, and stepped out into the winter air. Inside, the house buzzed with conversation and the faint strains of Bing Crosby on the radio. Megan greeted me at the door with a tight, nervous smile. You look sharp, Dad, she said, kissing my cheek. Thank you, sweetheart. Merry Christmas. I handed her the wrapped biography. Her eyes softened with gratitude. I could hear Jackson's voice in the living room, already regaling a crowd with some story. His laughter rang out, too loud, a performance for his colleagues. I set the bourbon on the table with the other gifts, shrugged off my coat, and steeled myself for the evening ahead. If this Christmas was going to be a battle, I was ready for it. The living room glowed with golden lamplight, the Christmas tree shimmering with silver ornaments in the bay window. Holiday music played softly in the background, but even Bing Crosby couldn't thaw the chill that crept into the corners when Jackson was holding court. He stood near the fireplace, surrounded by his friends from the law firm. Jackson always had an audience. You know, the old man still thinks Lincoln was a Republican for the same reasons as the modern party, he was saying, voice pitched just loud enough to reach me as I hung up my coat. The group around him laughed politely, unsure whether to join in or keep their distance. I took my place quietly near the back of the room, hands folded, listening. My daughter Megan moved between guests with practiced grace, refilling drinks and offering cookies, but I could see the tension in her jaw. The room was filled with little pockets of conversation, Jackson's parents discussing Florida real estate, the Hendersons chatting about their ski trip to Vermont, Jackson's colleagues exchanging inside jokes about court cases. I greeted the Hendersons and asked about their new puppy. Anything to delay joining the main group. But soon enough, Megan appeared at my side and gently guided me toward the cluster near the fireplace. Dad, let me introduce you to a few people. Jackson saw us coming. Everyone, this is Ed, my father-in-law, resident trivia master. If you need to know the price of bread in 1942, he's your guy. There was a ripple of awkward laughter. I smiled and shook hands with a young attorney named Paul, and then with Mrs. Lane, an elegant woman who taught art history at the local college. She looked at me with kind eyes and said, Megan tells me you taught history for years? 40 years, I replied, my voice steady. Mostly American history. Civil War was my specialty. Jackson grinned, sensing a new chance to needle me. Dad, maybe you can settle a debate. Paul thinks the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery in the South. I told him, you'd know, assuming you're not confusing it with something else. I caught Paul's uncertain look and answered. The Emancipation Proclamation declared slaves free in Confederate states in 1863, but it wasn't until the 13th Amendment in 1865 that slavery ended legally everywhere in the United States. A few nods. Even Mrs. Lane smiled. Jackson opened his mouth to say more, but Megan interrupted. Dinner's ready! Relief flashed across her face. Everyone began to move toward the dining room. The table was beautifully set with my late wife's china, candles flickering between platters of roast and bowls of cranberry sauce. As everyone took their seats, I noticed I'd been placed at the far end, across from Jackson. Megan sat beside me, her hand finding mine under the table for a brief squeeze. Dinner conversation started lightly enough, vacation plans, weather, Jackson's most recent case victory, but inevitably circled back to history. Dad, tell everyone about your most embarrassing teaching moment, Jackson prompted with a smirk. Didn't you once call the Declaration of Independence the Bill of Rights in front of 100 students? I could feel the room watching me. No, that's not quite how it went. I was quoting both documents in a single lecture. Students remember the slip-ups, but not always the corrections. There were a few chuckles, and to my surprise, Mrs. Lane said, We all have those moments. My students once thought Caravaggio was a brand of pasta. Jackson seemed momentarily thrown off by the support. He pivoted. Well, I guess it happens to everyone, even professors. But at least we all agree on the date of Vicksburg, right, Ed? His tone was mocking, but something about his eyes told me he was starting to feel outnumbered. I let my fork rest on my plate. May to July, 1863. I'm sure of it. But if you'd like to check, Megan has a set of encyclopedias in the living room. For a second, Jackson looked tempted to challenge me. But his mother spoke up instead, asking me about my time at Rutgers. The rest of dinner passed with stories, gentle laughter, and more than a few shared glances among the guests. I noticed Megan's relief each time the conversation turned to safe ground. As dessert was served, Megan's famous pecan pie, Jackson made one last attempt. Ed, you ever think about writing your memoirs? Might make for a fun little fantasy novel. A couple of his colleagues stifled smiles, but no one laughed outright. I met his eyes across the table, feeling the old strength rising up. Maybe I will, Jackson. And maybe I'll dedicate it to my favorite skeptic. For the first time all night, he didn't have a ready retort. After dessert, I excused myself and wandered to the living room, where the guests were slowly gathering again. A soft buzz of conversation filled the space. Mrs. Lane joined me at the bookshelf. I hope you don't mind me saying, but you handled yourself with remarkable grace tonight. I smiled, grateful for the kindness. Thank you, Mrs. Lane. Sometimes dignity is all you have left. She squeezed my arm. Sometimes it's all you need. As I looked around at the laughter and conversation, I realized that Jackson's approval, or lack of it, didn't define me. There was more to this holiday, and more to me, than one man's mockery. But the night wasn't over yet. People were drifting back into the living room, coffee in hand, the holiday playlist looping through familiar classics. I'd settled myself by Megan's crowded bookshelf, feigning interest in an old edition of Bartlett's Quotations, when I noticed a stranger approaching, a man I'd only seen in passing as he arrived with one of Jackson's coworkers. He looked to be in his early 70s, tall and silver-haired, with the kind of presence you find in people who've spent their lives standing in front of a classroom or a courtroom. He offered me a mug of coffee. Ed, isn't it? I'm Richard Bennett, retired professor from Princeton. History, mostly British Empire, but I know a bit about the American Civil War. His handshake was firm, his eyes bright with curiosity. I couldn't help but overhear some of the conversation tonight. He nodded toward Jackson, who was, even now, trying to impress a few young lawyers with tales of last year's ski trip to Vail. Richard lowered his voice. You handled yourself well. I know what it's like to have your expertise challenged by someone who's certain their Wikipedia search trumps decades of scholarship. I laughed, genuinely, for the first time all night. Thank you, Richard. I suppose it's part of the territory. And part of getting older, too. He smiled knowingly. Perhaps. But it's always refreshing to see someone keep their composure, even when provoked. We talked quietly, swapping stories about our teaching days, the quirks of undergraduates, and the shifting value of knowledge in an age where everyone carries the sum of human information in their pockets. It's not the facts that matter, Richard said, but the ability to think critically, to ask better questions. That's what real education is. From across the room, Jackson glanced our way, his eyes narrowing when he saw me talking to someone who seemed, for once, to be on my side. After a few minutes, Mrs. Lane joined us, followed by one of Jackson's colleagues, a sharp-eyed woman named Denise. She said, I didn't realize there were 2 historians at this party. No wonder the dinner conversation was more interesting than usual. Richard grinned. Ed here was just filling me in on the finer points of Vicksburg. He's exactly right, by the way, 1863. I checked on my phone just to be sure. He said this loudly enough for Jackson and his audience to hear. There was a subtle shift in the room. A few guests who'd been drifting toward the door stopped and turned back, suddenly interested in the new thread of conversation. Denise looked at Richard, then at me. You taught at Rutgers, right? That's impressive. I nodded. 40 years. Some of the best, and hardest, years of my life. Jackson, unable to resist, cut in. I suppose everyone's entitled to their opinion. But that documentary I watched said 1864. Can't blame a guy for trusting TV. Richard's smile was gentle but firm. Sometimes documentaries get it wrong. That's why we have historians to keep the record straight. Ed's right about Vicksburg. And frankly, I'd trust a man who spent his life in the archives over a television scriptwriter any day. For the first time all evening, Jackson had no comeback. He shifted uncomfortably, then tried to laugh it off. Well, I guess I'll stick to what I know best: corporate law, not history. There was a ripple of polite laughter, but it was clear the wind had changed. Several guests turned to me with newfound interest, asking about my years at Rutgers, my favorite era to teach, the books I recommended for anyone wanting to understand the roots of American conflict. Even Megan, watching from the doorway, looked relieved, her eyes meeting mine in silent gratitude. As Richard and I talked, more people joined in. We discussed everything from the legacy of the New Deal to the stories behind Ellis Island. For the first time that night, I felt like myself again, a teacher, a storyteller, someone whose knowledge had value. Richard raised his mug in a small, private toast. To those who keep the flame alive. I raised mine back. To those who remember why it matters. Around us, the house felt warmer, the lights brighter, the conversation more genuine. Jackson faded into the background, his earlier bravado replaced by awkward silence. The night was far from over, but something important had shifted. I'd come to Megan's house expecting to endure another Christmas as a quiet afterthought. Instead, I found unexpected allies and the promise that even in a new generation, respect could still be earned, not demanded, but given freely, when it was truly deserved. As the clock on the mantel chimed 10, I realized that this holiday might just turn out differently than any of us expected. The change in the room was almost physical, like a pressure finally released. With Richard's support, I found myself at the center of a small, lively circle. The conversations were more animated, more respectful. People asked about the strangest historical fact I knew: the Great Emu War in Australia was a hit, or what it felt like to retire after 4 decades at Rutgers. Even Megan, whose nerves had been tight as piano wire since I arrived, looked brighter now, weaving through the guests with a new confidence. She lingered near my chair as if drawing courage from the sight of me holding my own. Jackson, meanwhile, became a shadow. I noticed him hovering at the snack table, phone in hand, barely engaging with his own colleagues. His parents, always polite, always just a bit distant, chatted with the Hendersons about wintering in Florida. Every so often, Jackson's mother would glance over at me, her expression unreadable. I told a few stories: how I once got lost on a Civil War battlefield with a bus full of undergrads. The time my lecture on Ulysses S. Grant went so long the campus security had to unlock the classroom after dark. The laughter that followed felt genuine, the warmth in the room unmistakable. Richard was full of anecdotes from his own teaching days. My favorite moment, he said, was the year a student wrote an essay comparing Winston Churchill's speeches to rap lyrics. It was surprisingly insightful. I gave him an A. Even Denise, the sharp-eyed attorney, loosened up, admitting, "I always thought history was boring until tonight. You make it feel alive." For a moment, I felt years slip away, as if I were back in the classroom, surrounded by eager minds rather than polite, holiday strangers. It was a reminder of who I'd been, and who I still was beneath the wrinkles and gray hair. Megan slipped into the seat beside me, a plate of cookies in her hand. "Dad," she whispered, "thank you for coming. And for not letting Jackson get to you." I squeezed her hand. "You're my girl. Nothing could keep me away." She leaned her head on my shoulder, just for a second, and I felt a fierce wave of love, stronger than any embarrassment, sharper than any insult. The hours ticked by. At one point, Mrs. Lane played a few carols on the old upright piano, and the guests gathered to sing along. I added my voice, low and rusty, to Silent Night, remembering how my late wife used to hit every note just right, even as the rest of us fumbled the harmony. The memories stung, but in a good way. They reminded me I wasn't alone. A little later, as the clock neared midnight, people began to gather their coats. The mood was gentle, the goodbyes longer and more heartfelt than I'd expected. Denise shook my hand, promising to email about a book she wanted to read. Richard clapped me on the back and said, "If you ever want to visit Princeton's archives, you have a standing invitation." Mrs. Lane gave me a small tin of her homemade almond brittle, for when you need a little extra sweetness. Even Jackson's parents approached. His mother smiled thinly. "Ed, you certainly know how to hold a room," she said, her voice somewhere between admiration and surprise. It was nice to see a real scholar at work. Jackson himself kept his distance, lingering by the window, jaw tight, eyes dark with something like confusion, or maybe defeat. Megan helped me into my coat as the last guests trickled out. "Dad," she said softly, "I'm sorry Jackson was so difficult." I brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "We all have something to learn, Megan. Sometimes it just takes a little longer for some folks." As I stepped out onto the snowy porch, I felt the night air bite my cheeks. But inside, I was warm, warmer than I'd been in months. The drive home through quiet Maplewood was peaceful, the town's Christmas lights sparkling under the new snow. When I reached my house, I didn't feel the usual pang of loneliness. Instead, I'd put the almond brittle in the pantry, hung up my coat, and stood for a long time by the window, watching the snow fall, thinking about family, dignity, and the strange, wonderful gift of being seen for who you truly are. I realized then that, win or lose, I had stood my ground. I'd shown my daughter, and maybe even myself, that respect is earned by the way you carry yourself, not by the noise you make. The battle wasn't over. But I was no longer fighting alone. The morning after Christmas, the world outside was hushed under a new blanket of snow. Sunlight turned every branch to silver. I made myself a pot of coffee and tried to ignore the ache in my bones, a reminder that, despite my small triumph last night, I was no longer young. The phone rang just after 9. "Megan." Her voice was soft but steadier than usual. "Dad, I know it's early, but could you come over for breakfast?" When I arrived, the house was quiet, no guests, no holiday music, just the low hum of the heater and the clink of dishes. Megan hugged me at the door, holding on a little longer than necessary. "I made cinnamon rolls. And real coffee, not Jackson's bitter stuff." I smiled. "You always know how to tempt your old man." We sat together in the kitchen, sunlight painting gold across the table. I sipped coffee and watched Megan fuss with the butter dish, searching for words. "Jackson's out running errands," she finally said. He's not happy. He feels embarrassed. Says everyone was laughing at him." I nodded, choosing my words carefully. It's hard to be proven wrong in front of a crowd, especially if you're used to being the loudest voice in the room. Megan's eyes filled with tears she quickly brushed away. "I just wish he could see you the way I do. The way everyone else did last night." I reached across the table and took her hand. "It doesn't matter what Jackson thinks, sweetheart. What matters is that you know who you are, and who your family is. I spent too many years letting other people's opinions shape my own happiness." She squeezed my hand. "You taught me to be strong, Dad. I think I just forgot for a while." We ate in companionable silence, letting the warmth of cinnamon and memory fill the room. After breakfast, Megan poured us both another cup. "Can I ask you something? How do you always stay so calm when people push your buttons?" I laughed, a deep, genuine sound. "Oh, I lose my temper plenty. But I learned something in all those years of teaching: if you respond to shouting with more shouting, you just create noise. But if you hold your ground quietly, you become impossible to ignore. People remember dignity, Megan. They forget anger." She looked thoughtful. I wish Jackson could hear that. I patted her hand. "He will, someday. Maybe not today, but someday." Just then, the front door opened. Jackson stepped inside, snow melting on his boots. He paused when he saw us at the table, then gave a stiff nod. "Morning." Megan smiled tentatively. "We have cinnamon rolls." Jackson shrugged off his coat, but there was an uncertainty in his movements, a far cry from last night's bravado. He poured himself some coffee and stood by the window, silent for a long minute. Finally, he spoke. "Ed, I owe you an apology." The words hung between us, fragile as spun glass. "I shouldn't have tried to make you look foolish in front of everyone. I was wrong." He kept his eyes on the snowy yard. "I guess I wanted to impress my friends. Make myself feel bigger." I took a steady breath. "Thank you, Jackson. That means a lot." I resisted the urge to lecture. The apology, difficult as it was, spoke for itself. Jackson turned to face me. For the first time, I saw not just a son-in-law, but a young man trying to find his way, weighed down by pride and expectation. "You know, Megan always talks about your stories. I never really listened before. I think I should have." Megan squeezed his arm, her eyes shining. "Dad's got stories for days." Jackson managed a weak grin. "Yeah. I'd like to hear them sometime. Without the audience." There was an awkward pause, but it felt like the beginning of something new, a bridge being built, slowly, between two men who had never quite understood each other. I stood and clapped Jackson on the shoulder. "Anytime, son. Maybe next week, over a game. You like chess?" He nodded, a smile creeping onto his face. "Yeah. Sure." After he left the kitchen, Megan gave me a look that was half relief, half disbelief. I didn't think I'd ever hear him say those words. I smiled. Sometimes, the best lessons take a while to land. But they stick. Megan hugged me again, holding tight. "Thank you, Dad. For everything." I kissed the top of her head, feeling that fierce wave of love all over again. That's what dads are for. As I drove home later that morning, the sun high and bright above the snow, I felt lighter than I had in years. The old pain, the word, fool, the sting of being doubted, had faded, replaced by something steadier, respect, not just from strangers, but from the people who mattered most. The holiday wasn't perfect. The wounds of pride and misunderstanding didn't heal overnight. But something real had shifted in our family, proof that it's never too late to start over, to listen, to forgive. And as I parked in my driveway and stepped inside, I found myself humming a Christmas tune, grateful for the mess and beauty of family, and for the quiet strength that comes with age and a little bit of wisdom. The days after Christmas passed in a gentle blur of winter sunlight, quiet routines, and small moments of gratitude. The sharp edge of that holiday confrontation had dulled, replaced by something softer, an understanding, tentative but real, that maybe our family could finally turn a page. I kept busy in my own way. I spent time tending to the backyard bird feeders, brushing powdery snow from the porch railings, and losing myself in the world of books that had been my lifelong companions. Now and then I'd catch myself smiling, thinking of Megan's renewed confidence, of Jackson's apology, of the odd, wonderful feeling of being seen and respected, even if only for a night. One afternoon the phone rang. It was Richard Bennett, the retired professor from Princeton. "Ed, I'm putting together a little coffee group next Thursday," he said. "A few retired teachers, some younger folks, just good conversation and some stories about the old days. You'd fit right in." The invitation surprised me. I hesitated for only a moment. "Richard, I'd love that." On Thursday, I found myself at the corner cafe downtown. The air was filled with the scent of fresh pastry and the comfortable buzz of conversation. Richard greeted me with a warm handshake and introduced me to a half-dozen others. A retired math teacher, a woman who'd taught French in the city, an eager young librarian, and even Mrs. Lane, the piano player from Megan's Christmas party. We talked about everything: how teaching had changed, what students remembered years later, what it felt like to finally step out of the classroom and into a slower world. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged to a community, a place where my stories weren't just tolerated but welcomed. As the group broke up, Mrs. Lane lingered, handing me another tin of her almond brittle. "You remind me of my late husband," she said, her voice kind. "He believed knowledge was the best gift you could give someone. I think you do, too." I walked home through the bright cold, the streets sparkling with frost, feeling younger than I had in a long while. That weekend, Megan and Jackson invited me for dinner. It was a quieter gathering, just the three of us, with the kids tucked into bed early. Jackson tried to apologize again, but I waved him off. "Let's just move forward," I said. "That's the best gift we can give each other." He grinned, sheepish but sincere. "Deal." After dinner, we played chess at the kitchen table. Jackson lost the first 2 games but insisted on a rematch. "You're ruthless, Ed," he said with a laugh. "You hide it well." I shrugged, feigning innocence. "History teaches patience and timing. And sometimes a well-placed pawn does more than a king." Megan sat nearby, watching us, her eyes shining with happiness. The old tension was gone, replaced by an easy warmth I hadn't felt in years. When Jackson finally managed a draw, he leaned back and grinned. "Next week, I'm bringing my A-game." "That's the spirit," I said. Before I left, Megan hugged me tightly. "Thank you, Dad, for everything. I feel like I got my family back." I hugged her in return. "Me too, sweetheart." "Me too." At home, the holiday decorations glowed softly in the evening. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the snow drift down in lazy, peaceful spirals. I thought about the Christmas that began with humiliation and ended with new respect. About how pride and misunderstanding could be washed away by honesty, dignity, and the willingness to listen and forgive. I thought about Megan, stronger than she realized, and Jackson, finally learning that humility was its own kind of strength. I thought about myself, not just as an old man or a retired teacher, but as someone still capable of growth and connection. Life, I realized, had given me another chance, not just to be right, but to be kind. Not just to remember history, but to make it, in the small, quiet ways that matter most. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering everything in a blanket of new beginnings. I closed my eyes and gave thanks, for family, for friendship, for the stubborn spark that keeps us all moving forward, no matter how many winters we've seen. And somewhere in the distance, I could almost hear my late wife's voice, soft and proud. "You did well, Ed. You did well."